prayer, lair of my prayer, lair of my prayer. She welcomes you, she welcomes you. Come into the cave of my heart, cave of my heart, cave of my heart. She welcomes you, she welcomes you. Come into the cave of my heart, cave of my heart, cave of my heart. She welcomes you, she welcomes you. Come into the beat of my drum, beat of my drum, the beat of my drum. She welcomes you, she welcomes you. Come into the beat of my drum, beat of my drum, beat of my drum. She welcomes you, she welcomes you.
Welcome to all of you coming from very different parts of the world. We're so happy to have you here. My name is Rabbi Becky J, and I am the program manager of Emor, the Institute for Bold Jewish Thought. I'm delighted to welcome you here to today's program to continue our conversation with Smol Emuni, Israel's faithful left. In addition to streaming on this Zoom webinar, we are also excited to be streaming on Facebook Live. Emor, a project of Trua, is a thought leadership institute where we use Jewish sources, old and new, to invigorate our commitment to human rights and propel us to action. Emor is committed to bringing together people from all corners of the Jewish community to ask big and difficult questions, study Jewish texts, and hold courageous conversations about today's most important moral and political issues. As we get things started here, I've already invited you to share where you're coming from. If you're just joining, please let us know where you're coming from, where you're zooming in from, and give us a sense of what this Emor community looks like right now. Today's webinar builds on the series that we held over the winter called The Threefold Cord: How Democracy, Nationalism, and Human Rights Fit Together in the Jewish State in the 21st Century. All of these recordings are available on our website, emorinstitute.org, on the Israel and Occupied Palestinian Territories page. I encourage you to visit. Today's program is the continuation of another three-part series during which we will explore the uniquely Israeli Jewish response to the question of the threefold cord: the creation and rise of the movement, Smol Emuni, the faithful left. I am honored to have with us our guest teachers today, two leaders of this movement, the faithful left, who will teach us more about what they're doing and where Torah and Jewish texts reside in their quest for social justice. We'd like to welcome back Michael Menenkin, sorry, Michael, who is a longtime friend of Trua's. He's the director of Alliance Fellowship Program, an Arab Jewish political network in Israel. And before running the Alliance, Michael had served as the director of Mollad, a nonpartisan progressive think tank in Jerusalem, focusing on democratic change in Israel. Prior to that, he was the executive director of Breaking the Silence. In 2021, Michael published a book, At Halta, Ethics and Tradition in a Time of Power, in Hebrew. And the book, which we are very excited about, is set to come out in English later this year. He lives in Jerusalem with his wife and 3 children. I am also very excited to welcome to our Zoom space for the very first time Limor Yaakov Safrai, who is an education department director for the Southern Galillee Regional Council. She is on the board of Beit Lochamei HaGeta'ot, the Ghetto Fighters House Museum, and the Agricultural Cooperative Society in Maale Gilboa. Limor also serves as a member on the steering committee of the Dov Lautman Forum, which works on education for democratic values, and is also an assembly member of the Emek HaMa'ayot Economic Division. She grew up in Gush Qatif in the Gaza Strip and today lives on Kibbutz Maale Gilboa. In the past, she ran the youth division of the Religious Kibbutz movement. She also co-founded and ran the Torah and Avodah seminary. By popular demand, we've gathered for this webinar, our last in the series, to learn deeply about the roots of Smol Emuni in Jewish text and tradition. With that in mind, we've asked for Limor and Michael to teach us what is most important to them in terms of Jewish text and the movements that they are a part of. We want to thank you both for joining us here tonight, this afternoon, or depending on your coast, late morning. And Limor, we want to thank you for walking very briskly to get here, and also bringing to us texts that we might normally not have the privilege of coming to meet and encounter without you and the influence of this important movement that you are a part of. And so with that, I invite you to begin in whatever way feels right for you, but in a way where we can talk about why these texts might be foundational to your specific role as a pursuer of social justice in Israel, and how that relates to your connection with not only each other, but the other members in your movement.
Okay, hi, so good evening for everyone here in Israel, but wherever you are. So Michael, you want to start?
I'm fine with both. I think we'll just ping pong off each other. So hi as well. Yeah, maybe just before we dive in, the first is technical, which is if you feel like you want to ask questions on chat, we'll try to answer during the discussion and not wait till the end. And that's actually good for my ADHD. I'm happy to see all sorts of like messages popping up simultaneously. So that's the first semi-technical thing. The second that I would say for those who have been here in the past conversations is that I think up until now we've had the opportunity to talk about sort of the sociology and the politics of what it means to try to create a religious or reconstruct or construct religious left politics in Israel at this time, or just make larger, because there are other people doing things which we very much admire in this country. But I think any religious practice, as it's done, as you act, you also need to learn, and I think that's specifically true of Jewish religious practices. And it was very important for us from the get-go to not only protest and not only create conferences and things of that nature, but also learn together. And I think the question of what we learn and how we learn is a question that we're thinking quite a lot about, both in terms of how do we reconnect to literature which is already out there, to Jewish literature which is already out there, and also how do we maybe look for texts which are what would be the right word, inspirational to us or motivational for us, and things of that nature. So a lot of us come from a lot of different education spheres. There are people who come from ultra-Orthodox backgrounds and people who come from religious Zionist backgrounds. And when Limor and I were also thinking about this evening, we instinctively went for various very different types of texts, which we both really like. but I think I think that's part of what we're trying to do is appeal to texts coming from different times and from different movements who can potentially be be relevant for us. So maybe that's a bit of a vague introduction. But as we dive in, maybe we'll be more clear. And maybe lastly, I will say that one of the I wouldn't say necessarily challenges, as people on this call know, there are a lot of different streams of religious thought, and you feel at home usually with the sort of the language of the synagogue you were raised in. And the synagogues that we were raised in come from various Orthodox streams, so that those are the languages that appeal to us naturally most. But that's I imagine what we're going to be focused on. That's less of an issue of judgment. It's more of an issue of where we feel most at home. So it's important for me to get that out there, because even the names that I recognize here come from other very inspirational communities. We're trying to look back into our own communities and see what we can use that already exists within our subsect, if that makes sense. So that's a bit of an introduction. This is really fun for me also, because every time I come back and somebody else from our group joins, so we get to have a different type of conversation. So Limor, it's really fun for me to do this with you as well. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll give my introduction, or to read the text, or what do you suggest?
What do you prefer?
Okay, so I'll give a little bit of introduction, and then we'll read a short text. It's in Hebrew, but we will translate. So like Michael said, our roots are very different, but both of them are Orthodox religious. Like he said, I grew up in Gush Qatif in Gaza. It was a very Orthodox community, and very, it's a settlement. Were a settlement. But in my oldest roots, I discover the movement that called Kibbutz Adati, the Religious Kibbutz. And when I've been in education, when I was a guide in the kibbutz of the people, of the kids, so I discovered the text of people who wrote about the ideas of the religious kibbutz. I assume that lots of you know what is it kibbutz, but lots of people don't know, even here in Israel, the ideology of the religious kibbutz. So I'll say a few words about it, because I think it's important to understand the text, and also what happened today in this movement, because it changed. And I'm looking, like Michael said, to give it back to my community. So it's a movement that she holds two hands. One is to build the country, to live, to get a kibbutz, okay, all over the country, to do agriculture and to save the country, okay. But in the other hand, it's talked about ideals, okay, socialist ideals. But the main idea said that the people, the Jewish people, need to come here and make a new Israel Torah, okay? Torah Eretz Israel. Okay, I'm clear? Okay. I mean, the Tzionut is not only a escape or a shelter to the people, it's also a place, a new place, a revolution for the Torah. Okay, so here in Israel, the Torah need to develop, to exchange, to expand. And why? Because it's a new situation to the people. He has, in the first time, long time ago, state, and he control it. And the reality is new, don't have it in USA or anything, anywhere else. And the halacha needs to deal with this new situation and give answer to new dilemmas, questions, okay? Like how to get milk from a cow in Shabbat, or how to give electricity in Shabbat, or a modern agriculture in Shabbat when you want to do it by Jewish, okay? Economic life in state, like what do you do with Shemitah or with Ribit, okay? Or in our subject, what do you do with war? And how do you treat to civils that are non-Jewish? Okay, so all these questions, the kibbutz, the movement of the religious kibbutz, they said they need to deal with, because they can't be like Orthodox that against the state, and they are not like the Zionists that are not religious and they don't care about the Torah. They want to do this both, and now they want to change or to expand, not to change, to do the halacha, to walk, to do the steps. But they also, like most of the world back then, they want socialism, okay? But not like they said from Marx, okay? They said it like from Chazon HaNevi'im, okay? From the Torah. They thought that the person is equal between everyone because everyone came from God, right? Human being born by B'Tselem Elohim, okay? So that's why, although they were Orthodox, they believe in gender equality and national equality and partnership and honor. And that's why in the religious kibbutz, there was no rabbis, okay? Sorry from all the rabbis. They thought it's too much hierarchic, okay? They thought everyone is equal. Everyone need to learn, everyone need to work. Even when there were a rabbi in the kibbutz, they do Toranut Midbach. I don't know how you say Toranut.
Do kitchen duty.
Okay, everyone have the same duties. So it was, and that's why they were feminist, like in their time. Now it's not so feminist, but in their times. And that's why the text that I want to show you show that even they were very Zionist and they were very connected to the country, to the land, they thought that they have to treat equal to the Palestinians, okay? One of the biggest philosopher, okay, of the religious kibbutz was someone who called Moshe Una. He was in Sde Eliyahu kibbutz. He was a member of the parliament, of the Knesset, and he was Talmid Chacham, okay? And he also was a kibbutznik and Orthodox. And in 1945, he writes a very interesting text about the education. What is the 5 important things that we need, the goals, okay? The most important goals that we need to move to give to our children. And one of them was about the homeland. Michael, you can show the text that we will read.
Yeah. 1 second. I quickly could add other text. So I'm going to share screen. No, it's perfect. I got it. Share screen. Let's see. Here it is. This should be fine. It's the one here, right?
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So I will translate or to read it in Hebrew, to translate.
If you want, את יכולה לקרוא את זה בעברית, רוצה שאני אתרגם זריז לאנגלית?
Okay. As a מולדת, okay, homeland. So he said, okay, the place of this subject in education, he has, okay, no, translate, you translate, Michael, it will be
okay, so basically it says homeland, the place of this ideal in education as something psychological is very important. It's important to develop some sort of emotional connection between a child and his homeland, and it's important to love the homeland and to be rooted to it. But together with that, we need to explain to our children that our homeland has a very specific problematica isn't exactly problem, but we'll just say problem for the sake of translation. Our children need to know that the land of Israel is a homeland for two peoples. Our children need to understand that our neighboring people are connected to the homeland, and not to see the neighboring people as an enemy or as somebody who is in competition with us. It's a real, I think today, like a real radical approach in terms of how religious people speak.
Yes, and he was, like I said, a member of the parliament in what's called Mafdal. You know, Mafdal, like the first. איך אומרים מפלגה? שכחתי.
Party. First religious Zionist party.
First religious party, and it was like I don't know if it was no different, but it wasn't so radical like Michael said. He was a very mainstream person, and I think it's very, very important what he said. He said actually that it's not that it's belong to us, the country. We belong to the country, okay? But also the Palestinians belong to the country. So we have a problem here, yes? But he is not say that, okay, we have a problem, so let's go, or not deal with that. He said, okay, this is our homeland. We need to understand that, to love her and to educate our children to love her, but to know that the Palestinians also love her and belong to her, and this is their homeland. I think it's wonderful text, and it's guide me also today. Although today in the religious kibbutz, it's not so popular opinion today, sadly. מיכל, נדבר עכשיו על יוסקה, כאילו על הפער וזה?
כן, אפשר אולי. לא, נראה לי שזה טוב. נראה לי שזה בסדר, לא יודע, אני זורם איתך. Sorry, we're just talking as we go through. בוא נעשה שם. נראה לי שזה טוב כמסר, נראה לי. Yeah, we were just wondering if to go another text from the religious kibbutz, or to move on to other texts. But we can, yeah, maybe I'll do my text, and then we'll see if we have another time for your text, and then we'll go back. Because as you were speaking, even though I chose a text from 400 or 500 years earlier, which I don't think is a surprise in terms of where we're looking, in terms of our conversations that we always have with each other. It is a text that was written very near to where you live. It's a text that was written from Tzfat. One of the things that's been interesting for me to look at, well, it might have been written in Tzfat, it might have been written in Hebron, we're not exactly sure. But one of the things that have been interesting for me is to look at ethics and ethical literature in religious tradition, which a lot of times is hyper radical in terms of its approach to just personal behavior. And I think when I sort of re-engage with like Kibbutz Dati writing that Limor mentioned, and you look for sort of the ethical sources, a lot of times we talk about the prophets as a sort of symbol of people who are talking in maybe a language which perhaps is perceived as more universalist or something of that nature. Then it is always important for me to recognize that these streams of language have actually been very mainstream throughout a lot of parts of history. So the text that I chose from It's this book that we've actually been learning together in the Smol Emuni called Reshit Chochmah. Reshit Chochmah was written by somebody named Eliyahu Davidash. We don't know much about him. In the 16th century, we know that he was a student of Rabbi Moses Cordovero, who's actually a really, really important Kabbalist in Tzfat, who also wrote a very important Musar text called Tomer Dvorah, or the Palm Tree of Deborah. I think it was actually translated to English, but worth reading in Hebrew as well. They're both written in beautiful Hebrew, modern Hebrew. Thanks for the link. Awesome, Matt. But yeah, it's a text. We sometimes translate Musar literature to ethical literature, and that's a bit problematic, but we're going to do that for the sake of this conversation as well. It's a text that basically of a Kabbalist who views perhaps the most, a lot of times when we think about sort of the work that Kabbalists do in order to fix the world, we think of them as sort of, I think of them as sort of these plumbers who are fixing the universe by saying all sorts of things and meaning all sorts of meanings as they're saying text. And that's part of what these Kabbalists were doing. But a lot of what they were doing is try to create relationship with others as a mean to creating a relationship with God. So the idea is that if we behave in a certain way with our neighbor, or if we behave in a certain way with our surroundings, we're really not only emulating God, but we really are an extension of him or her. But what I would definitely in the case of Kabbalists who are focused primarily on Shekhinah, but not only. But I wanted to give the problem, I think, a lot of times with these Musar literature is we read them in a depoliticized way, maybe a bit new agey. And I think a lot of what they're saying is actually very relevant in terms of the socialist roots that Limor was mentioning before. So I wanted to give an example of that. There are 5 books in the Book of Rishi Chochmah, and the shortest one, the third one, is about repentance or tshuva. It has 7 chapters, and 4 of them are about fasting and the importance of fasting. So it's not a very light read, and maybe not very fun would be the right word. I think he demands a lot of the individual, but there's a flip. I'm not going to read it all, but I will show you a part of it. There's a flip which I find really interesting, especially in the times that we're living. So this is a text in front of me. And the first paragraph, I'll just read it directly in English. Maybe I'll say in advance that I think usually the construction that we think about when we fast is that the purpose of fasting is to prepare our soul to repent. And he actually flips it, and he says, the soul needs to prepare itself in order to fast. And the actual issue is the physical, not the emotional. And that's a very weird way of looking at things, meaning the fast is important in itself, not as a precursor to some sort of emotional revelation or some sort of spiritual revelation. The fast is important because it breaks down the body. And that is important in its own right. And he explains it, and he says that the fast is important. The fast, now I'm translating, the fast is critical for the returner, meaning for the repenter, because eating makes the heart full of pride, and pride leads to rebellion. And just like we learned in the previous book, he writes that a man usually rebels from a point of departure of being full, meaning of eating and drinking, because it says when it says in the Bible that after you eat and after you are full, you need to be careful Yishmu lechem pen yifteh levavchem, you know what we say every day, that after you that you need to be fearful, that and guard your heart, to not worship other gods. And he makes a connection that happens out of a place of being full. Right? That after you eat and you drink, you start being joyful in the negative sense. And I think what he's driving at is a counter model of sin. I think a lot of times we view sin, for example, theft, or even negative things which are done in the world, as a result of hunger or poverty. Meaning, when people don't have, they start sinning, and therefore we need to fix the situation and make sure that they have, so they won't sin. And he says that the opposite is the case, that people sin when they do have, and when they have too much. And you actually need to break that model in order for people to behave properly. And I think where we're coming at this, Limor and myself and other people in sort of our orbit, is that we're trying to relook at, what is the source of problems in our region. I would argue in your region as well. Is it coming out of hunger, or is it coming out of being full? And what Rishit Chochmah is saying is that it's coming out of a place of being full. And we actually, and when we look at fast, and we've got 2 big fasts coming up in the coming weeks, the fast is important in its own right, because that's what reminds you and sort of breaks your breaks you down physically out of the position of fullness. In that perspective, as I'm sort of reading this and thinking about what Limor just read, I actually think those texts, our 2 texts, are very interconnected, in the sense that they're both trying to constantly be conscious of the challenge when you actually have something in your hand, and to remember that in that context, you need to remember that there are others, or you need to remember that there are less, and sort of minimizing yourself, which is something which is really not a very popular sentiment, I think, right now. The idea of saying, wait a minute, we might have too much. Let's remember that there are others, is something that we're really trying to focus on. And one of the things that we constantly need to remind ourselves is actually the mainstream of our ethical tradition. Limor mentioned that Moshe Una was a parliament member, popular. I heard of him growing up. Other people did as well. It's not some, we didn't try to, we didn't. I'm so happy that you said that the Rishit Chochmah text seems like an argument against capitalism. That's what I was driving at, sir. but sorry. But I think that these texts are coming from a place which is very mainstream in our tradition, and sadly very, very lost right now. Again, I would say in Israel definitely, but I would argue in US, definitely, in terms of the world that I know more, in US Orthodoxy as well, definitely on the economic, but also on other issues. So trying to re-engage with those texts is also remembering that they're also within our traditions. So that's a bit about that. Rabbi Becky, I don't know if you have any other questions for us, but we'd be happy to field them.
We definitely have many questions for you, as always. So I'm not sure if we're going to get through all of them. And I just want to note that for everyone in the chat sending me questions. And I just want to say first, thank you for sharing those texts and weaving them together in a way that makes sense, but not as it's not the most obvious. It definitely was not the most obvious for me. And so I do want to speak to the 2 questions that just came up in response to your text, Michael. And ask if you could share screen again and just actually show us what lines you were referring to, because what's great about this group of people is people will study it after. And
Sure.
the
Yeah. 1 second.
yeah,
I'm gonna, sure.
just that the Reshi Chokmah text seems like an argument against capitalism and oligarchy, and Nathan Young also saying if we're going there, it seems like an argument for austerity.
Well, first, I mean, I would give a general argument in general with these texts, as these texts are not capitalist or anti-capitalist. I mean, I enjoyed the sort of the connection, but if we're honest, you know, all of these concepts are modern, and these texts were written a couple of hundred years before these ideas existed. So we need to, I'm sure one can read them in various lenses, and then the question is, how do I choose to read them? I don't think specifically I would say about, definitely in terms of Reshi Chokmah and others, I don't think these texts are very interested in building proper societies. I think these texts, by the way, this is where Moshe Una does differ, and the Kibbutz Adati movement does very much differ from, there are two different Torahs happening here. Reshi Chokmah, if anything interests him, it's leaving society, no matter what society, and building like a very radical and personal approach to his very own personal relationship with God, which comes through disconnecting as much as possible from the community, which he views as a community which idolizes power. So that's not a political position in terms of how we view. I think taking it back to also Limor's text, I think one of the things that we always bounce back and forth, and also within our group, is are we thinking about how a country should behave? Are we thinking about how we as individuals should behave? Are we thinking about how communities should behave? And these questions are obviously connected. I wouldn't say austerity is the right way for him to look at things. I think the right way for Reshi Chokmah to look at things is more about just personal hunger as a way to, it's not I also like this text because it's not a text which leads to like a healthy lifestyle in the modern sense. It's a text which is trying to create something which is very, very extreme. But I think because we're very trained to look for well-being and health, I think the fact that he sort of dares to go into areas of of guilt and of hunger and of all sorts of areas that we maybe shy away from for good reasons. So that's why this text is relevant. So hope that answers. It's by the way, because it doesn't say the chapter, it's chapter 3, if I remember correctly, chapter 3 or 4 from book 3, from the book on repentance in Religious Kibbutz.
Great. And just for clarity's sake, Michael, what line were?
It's the first. It's just the first. I read from the first 4 lines, but if I remember correctly, it's also the rest of the page. And what you see on the right, he quotes a lot from the Zohar. So what you see on the right is just the Hebrew translation. For those who don't, read that Aramaic. But basically the idea is, it continues, but I read the first 4 lines.
So one question that we have as well. Oh, sorry, did I interrupt?
No, I'm going to stop share if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
You had just mentioned that you and Limor bring 2 different Torahs to your learnings and to your activism. And one question that I personally have is, what does Smol Emuni look like from that perspective? How do you honor each other's Torahs? And a question that we did get from a participant is, do you feel the need to reconcile those Torahs? So is there any in the process of learning and living in this movement, when you disagree, what happens?
לימור, רוצה לנסות?
So we disagree, in the Yadut, right? The disagreement is part of the Bet Midrash culture, right? I mean, we talk, we argue, we try to get to agreements. Some of the things we put outside, some of the things we did. I mean, someone here asked about Eretz Lekulam, right, Matt? So Michael and I, a lot of the time, right? It's fine, Michael. Like we argue about how radical we need to be, how pure we need to be, and how to expand the people that agree with us in general, but the tactic or the details sometimes we're not think alike, and sometimes it's really hard, it's not little things. It's like if a person in the settlement can be part of our Smol Emuni, okay? He live in a place like, that may be a problematic place, yes, but he believe in the same values. So it sounds very complicated, but so yes, we have argument and the roots may be different, but the goals are the same, so it's fine.
Yeah, I also think and I think it was clear from how it was posed that I probably would take the more radical position on that one. But I think it's also a learning process for all of us in terms of how do you remember this is an educational process for a lot of us and for ourselves included, and to create a Torah tent which is large enough for as many people, especially because a lot of us are coming from places that we're usually outside of those tents, even if we're more moderate or more radical. So it's very important for us to be conscious of the fact that there are other people who want to be inside. So Limor gave one example of settlements, and I would give also just other examples. There are people. I mean, both Limor and I grew up in sort of religious Zionist worlds, but there are people who are coming from ultra-Orthodox worlds, and they would have a challenge with probably both texts for other reasons, and they bring their own texts inside, and I think there's enough to connect us value-wise, but also in terms of the tradition. Meaning, I think it's not only my sense is that also the Haredim in the group would really like that text that you brought from Moshe Una. Meaning, I think it would have if worked well. We're probably thinking of the same people. I think they would like that text as well, and I think that's what texts allow for. Yeah.
There are more
No.
questions.
Yeah, there was a question about it where the place online about text and pooled and shared. Not really. That's a great idea. We'll write that in our group. I mean, Limor, maybe you should talk. Sorry, I'm going to push you because you pushed me. But, about the stuff for Jerusalem Day that you worked on, because that actually really connects to that question.
Right. Okay. So lots of the texts are not in online, not in Hebrew, not in English, nothing, because it was, ages ago in books, but it's a good idea. In Jerusalem Day, we were thinking what to do. Again, like, right, that there are lots of, איך קוראים למצעד הזה?
There's a march on Jerusalem which goes through a very aggressive flag march which goes through the Muslim quarter, and we're trying to think about how to counter that in different tools.
And almost every religious Zionist high school goes to this march, to this flag march. And we thought in the Smol Emuni how to do something education about that, because that's where I came from. So we wrote
like syllabus for class or like for high school.
Syllabus for school. 3 lessons. We wrote 3 lessons. Me and my friend Yoel, we wrote 3 lessons about anti-races and alternative to Jerusalem. You know, is it one place that we need to be happy, or this is a very conflict place that actually have the south and the south, east and west Jerusalem, and what Palestinians have been through there, and the influence of this thing, and if it's belong to us or it's belong to everyone, to every religious, and we set it everywhere that we know that people can be interested. And we heard some of the teachers that taught their student about it. It was very excited. So we write text. We don't just bring text. We also write text about that.
Yeah.
Maybe we should translate and
yeah.
do things online.
I actually think the translation is very important, because a lot of times when you speak with groups, with Jewish groups in the U.S. or anywhere around the world, there's a question of sort of like what can be done, how can we help, and things like that. And I actually think on this issue, first of all, it's not about who's helping who, but how are we creating and learning together? Like ultimately, we're all, I think, you know, we talked about what separates sort of the different groups in response to your question, but what connects us are these texts. Like ultimately, we all go back, you know, we know maybe not in the last 3-4 generations, but you go back 5-6 generations, everybody's learning roughly the same text, and a lot of times that's a great connector. So looking back at, like, you know, texts which were written, you know, like from Mishnah on, are texts which are relevant to everybody in the group. And I think it's also, and obviously they weren't created within these borders necessarily, and they don't end, but you don't end studying them at the borders. The texts are borderless, and I think that's what creates a relationship with you guys as well. And by the way, also, like, we read, obviously, constantly texts coming from other places. So that's important, you know, as well.
Michael, you want to answer to the same question?
Well, yeah, sure. I'll look at it quickly. I would say that we all want to end occupation. And I think that and it's important for us to speak that. And it's important for us, it was a unexpected move that we put left in our title. I don't think we're trying to moderate a right-wing opinion by making it a bit more digestible or making it a bit more nuanced. We're fine with polarizing positions within our communities. Do we have a specific vision? No. And I think, and I don't think that's our role in this. I mean, we all have our own opinions, and that's okay as well. But I think our role is more of an issue of focusing on the values of this, and of the basic question of, you know, military rule, equality, that kind of thing. In the conference that we did a couple of months ago, there were people who spoke from a two-state perspective, and there were people who spoke from a confederation perspective. And I imagine that there were probably like binationalist one-staters as well. And that's okay. It's not, we're also not really sitting right now at a table where we need to discuss these things. I think it's more about the educational component and the political component. And those of us who are interested in those kind of things are also active in a bunch of other organizations as well. So this isn't a shying away from the issue. This is actually trying to be much more engaging with these issues just from a different perspective. And I would also say, when I talk about equality between Jews and Palestinians, I'm not only talking about things which pertain to the occupation, but also things which are relevant inside 1948. So this is about ethnic superiority in general, not only in terms of the question of two states in Palestine, but also the question, I think, in some respects, I think even a more challenging and crucial and important question is a question of what's called the Palestinian minority within Israel, and how what is the dynamic there, and how do we create a language about that. And this book just came out in Hebrew, but I'm going to put it anyway because it's also relevant. There's a book that came out this week by a friend whose name is Aviram Tsoref, which is a monograph of a religious thinker named, his pen name was Rabbi Binyamin, who wrote in the 30s, 40s, and 50s primarily, not only, and focused constantly from a religious perspective on what does it mean to live with another nation. I'm thinking about Moshe Ona again. Like, what does it mean to have two nations living next to each other? And that was a large part of his focus and a large part of his writing. So accessing that it's not only an occupation issue, it's a general issue about two peoples living in the same area. Shoshana asked a question as well. Do you want to take that?
Yeah. Yes, I'll say it's connected to what Michael said first, but we're not just learning together. We do think about ma'asim, okay, actions, but also in a very different places, together and separated. Like we have friends that helps Palestinians in the Bik'ah to keep their lands and their water from the settlement people that try to take them, and the people that call Tag Me'ir, Tag Me'ir, it's like people that try to against the actions against Palestinians. They do things that take bonding to help Michael.
Yeah,
Tag Me'ir.
Tag Me'ir is basically a lot of it is solidarity visits to Palestinians who were affected by either settlement or sometimes military violence as well. There's Bnei Avraham. A lot of us are active in Hebron, working with Palestinians, but also important for me to say, a lot of us are active in refugee issues. A lot of us are active in social economic issues. Where our instinct is in Maaseh, not in Torah. This is the flip of what we usually do. Yes. We're all activists. But we want.
What do we want to say? It's like people ask me if I'm more feminist or more religious, and how it's not a
contradictory.
Yes. Okay. So I'm saying I'm feminist because I'm religious, and I say the same thing about this. I'm in the Smol because I'm Emuni, okay? Because I'm religious. I believe it's from the same place. It's from the same root. I believe that this is what God wants from you, okay? If we'll say it like that. This is the right things to do, okay? So we do that. We just learn and back up our actions by learning, or to remind other people that it's not something that I do although I'm religious. It's because I'm religious, and it's hard to say it today. So we need to learn to show everyone and to understand that it's belong to our Torah and not something strange to that.
Yeah, I mean, also it's if there's anything which is, I think that what Limor just said of Smol because of Emuni, I think that's maybe a bit of a rebellion also against sort of maybe a generation prior to us in terms of religious and left activists who are very cautious about sort of mixing the two, and and they're not to name any names, but that's I think there are sort of thinkers who did important work and were very upfront against occupation and war kippot, or usually war kippot more than war kisui rosh, but war kippot, and they said, but this has nothing to do with each other. This is, I daven at shul, and then I say one thing, and then I'm active against the occupation. That's another thing, and I think if anything connects everyone in terms of who's pushing this forward is that we don't see things that way. That for us it's very interconnected, and when the words that we pray in the morning have significance to how we treat questions of social and ethnic and national inequality, and if there's anything, I think that's a bit sort of a shift in terms of how sort of religion and liberalism or left is done in this country. It's a very conscious understanding that we're trying to do something which is very holistic in that regard, despite what sometimes people would say the dangers of mixing the two. We'd rather be in that dangerous territory, I think. Yeah.
On that note, embracing the danger and coming full circle, because Michael, in our first webinar, you actually said that you and others of Smol Emuni fall on the left precisely because of your religious values. And I agree with Rabbi Dreffin, who said, who just lifted Limor's words, I'm in the Smol because I am Emuni. We have come full circle. So I want to thank both of you for modeling that intersectionality and identity, and modeling the embrace of being in the dangerous place and acting, and for teaching us your Torahs today. In closing, we are just so grateful for you and the time that you have afforded us, and for the privilege of witnessing the work that you're doing, connected in tradition.
Thank you so much. Thanks also for allowing us to talk with you guys. Thanks.
I would love to thank the Torah and Emor staff who made today's program available and possible and run smoothly. Rabbi Matt Dreffin, Shira Danan, Bennett Decker, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, Rachel Lerner, and Lev Meritz Nelson. The music you heard as we started the program was Cave of My Heart by Ibrahim Baba, Taya Ma, and friends. And we are excited to also announce that we're well underway with Fragments, the second iteration of our publication, due to popular demand. Very, very exciting. So please be on the lookout for that. And please also be aware that our first issue of Fragments, Freedom, is available for download on our website. Again, we'd like to thank you all at Smol Emuni, specifically Limor and Michael. Toda, toda. And we wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.